Well,
stuff that
think of it
comes
in the
later.
context of their time too. That their leadership had let them down. Like
Yes.
Ezekiel was supposed to be the good watchman, but their own leadership hadn't been telling them the truth and leading
Well,
them into the covenant ways.
there's a verse we didn't read from Lamentations where it talks about the Gentile nations reviling the priests and prophets as unclean. And like the Gentiles who don't even have the cleanliness law see the very priests and prophets of God's people as unclean. That's how terrible the leadership was. And
Well,
that's exactly what's going on.
welcome to Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. I'm Timothy.
And I'm Caleb.
And you're listening to Bible Discussions, the forum where we explore biblical topics that are relevant to your life. Today we are continuing our series entitled, Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him? And today we're going to be looking at the Old Testament book of Ezekiel. And we're going to talk about how Ezekiel wants us to know that God, He is the Lord. He has a little catchphrase he says, know that I am the Lord, and that's what we're going to talk about. And in the New Testament, we're going to talk about how we can know that Jesus is Lord. So, Caleb, Ezekiel's kind of a strange book. It's got a lot.
You really only have two options: either he was actually seeing visions of heaven, or he was just on some wild mushrooms.
Yeah. He's seeing all kinds of things. He's trying to describe them, and I guess from our perspective, like we have a lot more technology and things than he had, and we read some of these visions he's having with wheels spinning and all kinds of things, and people try to say they're spaceships and whatever, but it's just like he's trying to explain whirling lights and things that he sees.
You can go down some real interesting rabbit holes on the internet about angels and things that he sees, and I wouldn't recommend it.
But the beauty of Biblocus in our series here is that we're picking one main theme from each book, and we're talking about how that theme is developed in the Old Testament, and so that makes it easy for us because Ezekiel has this catchphrase that I said a minute ago, know that I am the Lord. Sometimes it's, you will know that I am the Lord. They will know that I am the Lord. But it's used over 50 times, depending on how you count it up.
Yeah, what Jeremiah said again and again, like 12 times or something?
Yeah, we're not going to look at every time like we did in Jeremiah.
But this is the first of a 3-part series on Ezekiel.
Yeah. But ultimately, the message that Ezekiel was sent to proclaim was that you should know that I am the Lord. That was God's message that he sent him with. And so that's what we're going to focus in on. And so, Caleb, you're the historian now. Give us a little bit of a background on Ezekiel.
Okay. So you should be noticing a pattern here. For the last handful of episodes, we've started by discussing how Israel and then Judah are being conquered and then taken into captivity. Like we've talked about, you can see the historical in the historical books in 2 Kings. You can see where this happens. Now there were multiple deportations from Jerusalem to Babylon. If you remember, Nebuchadnezzar conquered the city once, but left it relatively intact so it could keep producing wealth and pay him tribute. But when they rebelled, then he came back and just burned everything. So the conquest happens in phases. There are multiple deportations. So in 605 BC, Daniel and his companions were deported. In 597, it was Jehoiachin and all the officials, which would include Ezekiel because he was a priest. And then in 586, everyone that was left in the city when it was sacked. So there are multiple phases here. So Ezekiel's leaving in 597, and his life and ministry are tied up in these events. And I'll point out there's an overlap here with Jeremiah too, right? Because this is during Jeremiah's prophecy as well.
Yeah, but the cool thing is that Ezekiel's in Babylon.
Yeah,
when he's prophesying.
Yes, Jeremiah doesn't leave Jerusalem, but Ezekiel goes into exile and prophesies from there. So it's kind of like God wanted to make sure that as the Israelites were being separated, that they each had their own prophet in their little corners of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's too bad. There wasn't probably an epic like meetup of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and all these people.
Well, so let's look at Ezekiel 1, verses 1 through 3, and see what Ezekiel says about the beginning of his own ministry. It says, "In my 13th year, in the 4th month of the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kibar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kibar River in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was on him." So, according to Ezekiel, his prophesying started around 593-ish BC, and after he had been in Babylon 5 years. And then the difference, I guess, between the 13 and the 5 years that it talks about there is the two different deportations that were separated by 8 years.
Yeah.
And so so it's kind of interesting. God charges Ezekiel from the beginning of his ministry to be a watchman for Israel. So in Ezekiel 3, verses 16 through 19, it says, "At the end of 7 days, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the people of Israel. So hear the word I speak, and give them a warning from me. When I say to a wicked person, you will surely die, and you do not warn them or speak out to dissuade them from their evil ways in order to save their life, that wicked person will die for their sin, and I will hold you accountable for their blood. But if you do warn the wicked person and they do not turn from their wickedness or from their evil ways, they will die for their sin, but you will have saved yourself." So
Yeah, that's really interesting. God's saying, no, either way, the evildoers are being punished for their deeds. But if you don't even try to stop them and help them, if you just kind of consider them as a lost cause and ignore them, don't preach to them at all, then I'm going to hold you accountable for that as well.
yeah, and I mean that
Which
would just
should make us worried a little bit.
I'm sure it had Ezekiel's attention. Like, oh, great. Well, so he repeats this charge to him later in the book in chapter 33. You want to read this?
Sure. "The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, speak to your people and say to them, when I bring the sword against the land, and the people of the land choose one of their men and make him their watchman, and he sees the sword coming against the land and blows the trumpet to warn the people, then if anyone hears the trumpet but does not heed the warning, and the sword comes and takes their life, their blood will be on their own head. Since they heard the sound of the trumpet but did not heed the warning, their blood will be on their own head. If they had heeded the warning, they would have saved themselves. But if the watchman sees a sword coming and does not blow the trumpet to warn the people, and the sword comes and takes someone's life, that person's life will be taken because of their sin, but I will hold the watchman accountable for their blood." So it's kind of like they're not innocent per se, but it's this guy's fault.
Yeah.
And that should, well, sorry, there's more to go here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in verse 7, "Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the people of Israel. So hear the word I speak and give them a warning from me. When I say to the wicked, you wicked person, you will surely die, and you do not speak out to dissuade them from their ways, that wicked person will die for their sin, and I will hold you accountable for their blood. But if you do warn the wicked person to turn from their ways, and they do not do so, they will die for their sin, though you yourself will be saved."
Yeah, so he's got this general thing about watchmen. He's like, well, everybody knows, a watchman's job is like, hey, don't fall asleep and watch for the enemy and blow the horn, and all that.
Mhm.
And he's like, it's the same principle for you. That's who you are. That's the job I'm giving you. I'm giving you these messages from me to everybody to warn them about what's coming. And if they don't listen, then that's on them.
Yeah.
And we know from Jeremiah that whether God, no matter how early he gets up and how hard he works and how many times he warns them, they don't listen.
Right.
So
Yeah, but at least you tried, right? If you gave the warning. If they're not going to listen, then they'll perish either way.
yeah,
And that should, I think, give us some context for how to deal with our own culture now, that it's less and less a Christian culture.
Mhm.
And I don't think the right approach is just to withdraw into a little bubble,
Yeah.
and withdraw from the culture, because then
Mhm.
we're not able to have any kind of an impact. But you also don't want to, it's probably not helpful to go out. I thought of, when I read this, I thought of like the Westboro Baptist Church.
Oh yeah, no, they're bad.
Famously bad example.
Mhm.
I'm not going to say their URL out loud, but if you just Google them and see what the name the name of their website is called, it's just a prime example of how not to do this. Because I think there is a charitable way, a merciful way to proclaim, God's commands
Yeah.
to warn people against their sin.
Hmm.
And it's not just smacking them in the face with the Bible and telling them they're going to hell. You're going to drive people away from God by doing that.
Well, actually, that might be a good lead-in or summary of what God was really saying to Ezekiel. Because it's a sobering thing to be considered God's prophet. I mean, you might think, "Wow, it'd be really cool to be one of God's prophets." Well, you might want to go read the book of Jeremiah or Ezekiel before you say that.
See how miserable Jeremiah was.
Yeah, and Lamentations that we just did last week, and knowing that these oracles that God gives you to give people, they're not going to listen to them, and that leaves you kind of frustrated and sad. And
you
then
have to give them anyway, like
Yeah.
knowing that they're going to be ignored.
and then God's like, okay, I know you might feel that way, so He's telling Ezekiel, don't just not tell them because it just makes you feel sad and bad.
You have a responsibility. It's like in
Mhm.
James when James says, "Brothers, not all of you should want to be teachers because teachers will be judged more harshly."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's like a weight on your shoulders with that.
So we're not going to read the whole book of Ezekiel. You're welcome. You can.
That's 48 chapters.
Yeah, it's a long one, but I'll just give you a quick breakdown. I'll put it up on the screen. And this comes from a really great book by Fee and Stewart called "How to Read the Bible Book by Book," and it just break it down into three sections. There's chapters 1 through 24 are oracles that Ezekiel gives against Israel generally. And then Ezekiel 25 through 32 are oracles of judgment against the nations. And then Ezekiel 33 through 48 are oracles of hope and consolation. And so Ezekiel is broken into these three, major sections like this. And that all throughout all three different sections, he still uses his catchphrase that you will know that I am the Lord. And so there's different groups of people he's talking to. Sometimes it's the Israelites, sometimes it's foreign country, and then sometimes it's us in the future.
Yeah. There's 48 chapters and 50 uses of "know that I am the Lord."
Yeah,
which of course the chapters are made after the fact to make it easier for us to, find things in it. But it's frequent enough that there could be one in each chapter.
Yeah. Well, and Kayla mentioned earlier what we've been saying the last few weeks about beginning in Isaiah and Jeremiah. We've been talking about how they're calling people back, the prophets call people back to the covenant. And so you say, well, why is Ezekiel's catchphrase that you will know that I am the Lord? Why is God telling him to say that over and over again? And there's a very simple reason why. Because if you go back to Exodus 20, verse 2, right, it says, this is the prologue to the 10 Commandments, right? The most basic and beginning of all God's commandments to his people. And that in Exodus 20, verse 2, it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And so God had already told us, if we had been listening, if anybody had been listening to him, if the Israelites had been listening, that he was the Lord their God, and he had saved them with his mighty hand out of Egypt. So they already knew, they'd already experienced it. They've already been benefactors of God and his greatness as Lord.
Yeah. Depending on how you reckon the 10 Commandments, because there's actually a disagreement on how to count them, because it kind of looks like there's like maybe 13 commandments, but it's referred to as the 10. So depending on how you count it, sometimes that statement that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt is reckoned as the first commandment or part of the first commandment.
Yeah.
And it comes several other times in Exodus as well.
Yes.
In Exodus 6, when he brings them out of slavery, he says, I am the Lord your God.
Yes.
In Exodus, that's when he calls them anyway, through Moses. And in Exodus 10, when he's performing signs and the plagues in Egypt, he says it again. In Exodus 16, when he provides quail and manna in the desert. In 29, when he comes to dwell among them in the tabernacle. And in 31, when they're ordered to keep the Sabbath.
Yeah, and all of those are just to the Israelites.
Right.
And so there's 5 of those, and then there's 4 more that he gives to the Egyptians in Exodus, where he says the same phrase, that you will know that I am the Lord. In Exodus 7, when he stretches out his arm to rescue the Israelites out of Egypt, he said, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And also in 7, when he turns the Nile to blood, he says it would be so Pharaoh will know that I am the Lord. And then in 14, there's 2 places where he says, in 14:4, he says, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart to pursue the Israelites, and he'll know that I'm the Lord. And then in 14:18, he says, I'm going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians to follow them into the sea, and then they're going to know that I'm the Lord. And
like the last 12 seconds.
Yeah, for a split second while the water comes back over them.
Yeah.
So, we're going to look at a few of the typical oracles, one from each of those sections of Ezekiel that we talked about, to Israelites, to the nations, and to the future.
And I want to point out here with all of these Exodus examples, this is, well, first of all, it's the starting point of the law, right? In Exodus 20, when he begins to give the law. That is the basis that all of the law is then given upon. And also, every time it comes up here, it's being done with a with judgment, or with a command, or with salvation, or in a promise,
Yeah.
It's always underpinning God's judgment or God's salvation.
Yeah.
The law and the gospel is when he's saying that phrase here throughout Exodus.
Yeah, we're going to see that very clearly in each of these examples, how they're tied to judgment. So, and again, with a prophet, that's what you would expect, right? I mean, and also in the dire times that Ezekiel is prophesying.
Yeah, but some of these, like when he says that he'll save him out of Egypt, or when he gives them the manna and quail, it's not a judgment. It's a
that's true. Before,
blessing,
when they should have learned that he was God. Yeah. When in the good times, just like we saw in Psalm 32, like, when God says, pray to me in a time when I can be found. Pray to me in the good times. I'm tired of people coming to me when everything's going wrong, right?
Yeah, and then you have the fascinating example of the plagues, which is that a command? Is it a judgment, or is it a salvation moment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's both.
Yeah.
Like from
the nations and Israel.
Yeah, so Egypt is supposed to see the judgment and know that God is the Lord. And Israel is supposed to see the salvation and know that God is the Lord. And that's how, I think I've talked about this before on here. That's how I look at that supposed contradiction about who's hardening Pharaoh's heart. Is it God or is it Pharaoh? Because 3 times he says, I'll harden Pharaoh's heart, or Pharaoh harden his heart, or Pharaoh's heart will be hardened, in both perspectives and then in the passive. And I just think that's it. Like, God's being God here. He's judging the wicked and he's saving his people. And if you're set against God, then you're just going to harden your heart against that. And he knows that, but he's not going to not be God. He's not going to stop being good, and saving his people.
That makes sense.
Whereas if you are inclined towards God, you're going to see that and respond with faith.
Yeah. Well, let's look at this first oracle that we've picked. It's Ezekiel 6, verses 1 through 10, and this is an oracle to the Israelites. So it says, the word of the Lord came to me, son of man, which, by the way, if you read through Ezekiel on your own, you'll see Ezekiel is called the son of man all the time. Set your face against the mountains of Israel. Prophesy against them and say, you mountains of Israel, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to the mountains and hills, to the ravines and valleys. I am about to bring a sword against you, and I will destroy your high places. Your altars will be demolished, and your incense altars will be smashed, and I will slay your people in front of your idols. I will lay the dead bodies of the Israelites in front of their idols, and I will scatter your bones around your altars. Wherever you live, the towns will be laid waste and the high places demolished, so that your altars will be laid waste and devastated. Your idols smashed and ruined, your incense altars broken down, and what you have made wiped out. Your people will fall slain among you, and you will know that I am the Lord. Now, see, this one's in the context of some judgment. And so now it continues. It says in verse 8, but I will spare some, for some of you will escape the sword when you are scattered among the lands and nations. Then in the nations where they have been carried captive, those who escaped will remember me. How I have been grieved by their adulterous hearts, which have turned away from me, and by their eyes, which have lusted after their idols. They will loathe themselves for the evil they have done, and for all their detestable practices, and they will know that I am the Lord. I did not threaten in vain to bring this calamity on them.
Yeah, and that second one I think is more of a salvation moment because he's saying he'll spare some of them, and that they will actually learn to hate the evil. Right? They'll
Yeah,
see things clearly, and so
because of the judgment
yeah,
that
it's
they've
not that it
witnessed.
isn't painful, but like we've talked about in Numbers, when you
Yeah,
bring the holy thing among you, whether that's in the corporate form, like with all of the people, in a large group, large numbers of the people in Numbers died off, and here,
yeah.
I mean, the whole country is just ravaged.
Hmm.
Or in a personal sense, you start to destroy the evil in yourself. Like you bring him in there, you have to do away with that. You have to learn to see things right, see what's good for good and evil for evil.
Yeah. Well, but you can see that the knowledge of God is tied to this conviction you're talking about, this punishment of sin. I mean, it's like very plain. He's tying it back to the commandments because he's like, the idols you've made, all the dead bodies are going to be piled up in front of the idols
Yeah.
all over your country, and the idols are going to be smashed. And it reminds me of when the Philistines stole the ark and put it in their temple, and then they come in the morning, their God is on his face in front of it
His
every
hands
day.
and head broken off, I
Yeah,
think.
and the
Yeah.
second day, he's all smashed.
Yeah.
And it's similar to that. It's like, well, and God says at the end of this passage, he says, you're going to see, I didn't threaten in vain to bring this calamity on
Mhm.
you. If the blessings and the curses are real, the blessings are real and the curses are real. And so it's the first commandment, right? To have no other gods before God,
Mhm.
before the Lord. And they're worshiping idols, you know? And so then some of them survive, right? And they loathe themselves for what they've done. And then they realize, oh, now I know that God is the Lord. You know?
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. I think every sin is a violation of the first commandment.
yeah.
Because at some point you've decided to put something else before God. So
So we see that clearly with the Israelites here. So now we've got one with the foreign nations. Caleb, you want to read this oracle against the nations in Ezekiel 25, 1 through 11?
I thought you'd never ask. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against the Ammonites and prophesy against them. Say to them, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because you said, aha, over my sanctuary when it was desecrated, and over the land of Israel when it was laid waste, and over the people of Judah when they went into exile, therefore I am going to give you to the people of the east as a possession. They will set up their camps and pitch their tents among you. They will eat your fruit and drink your milk. I will turn Rabbah into a pasture for camels and Ammon into a resting place for sheep. Then you will know that I am the Lord. For this is what the sovereign Lord says. Because you have clapped your hands and stamped your feet, rejoicing with all the malice of your heart against the land of Israel, therefore I will stretch out my hand against you and give you as plunder to the nations. I will wipe you out from among the nations and exterminate you from the countries. I will destroy you, and you will know that I am the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because Moab and Seir said, look, Judah has become like all the other nations. Therefore, I will expose the flank of Moab, beginning at its frontier towns, Beth Jeshimoth, Baal Meon, and Kiriathaim, the glory of that land. I will give Moab along with the Ammonites to the people of the east as a possession, so that the Ammonites will not be remembered among the nations. And I will inflict punishment on Moab. Then they will know that I am the Lord.
So again, it's the same thing. When these nations are judged, then God's saying, then you'll realize I shouldn't have spoken against God's people because he is the Lord.
Mhm. Yeah, God got it wrong though there because he said that they clapped their hands and stomped their feet in malice. But that's supposed to be if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands, right?
Oh, well, in children's songs, maybe. um, just for the record, God didn't get anything wrong. um,
I thought that was kind of funny. That's
and-
literally like you said, aha,
yeah,
and then you clapped your hands and stomped your feet. It's
yeah.
like, but
So,
they were the point is they were mocking
yes.
Israel, mocking
Mhm.
God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, knowledge of God is tied to judgment, right? So judgment of these nations leads to their knowledge of God. And it's not because it has to be that way, right? Because like Caleb was saying in the beginning, God just did it, by saving people and showing how good he could be to them, and they didn't pay any attention to him and didn't
Hmm.
didn't respect him. The foreign nations didn't see, oh, look how he saved them out of Egypt. We should respect them. And they laughed when they fell and mocked them. And God's like, well, they really are my people.
Yeah.
So they could have learned. Everybody could have learned the lesson. The Israelites, the foreign nations, they all could have learned initially, and not had to go through this. But God wanted them to know that He was the Lord.
Hmm. Yeah, we're slow learners.
So then there is the positive side of this. Depending on how you look at this, the hopes for the future, the oracles of hope and consolation, and I had a hard time picking like which one to look at, but this one's a very long one, maybe the longest reading we've ever done on here. It's Ezekiel 34, and it's about the shepherds of Israel and how they're corrupt, and God's going to be the good shepherd. So you can see how it's about the corruption of the nation and the hope for the future by God becoming the shepherd. So I'm just going to go ahead and start reading this, and we'll get through it eventually. So
Go get some popcorn.
Ezekiel 34. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak or healed the sick or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd, and when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd, and so has been plundered and has become food for all the wild animals, and because my shepherds did not search for my flock, but cared for themselves rather than for my flock. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. For this is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines, and in all the settlements of the land. I will tend them in a good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. There they will lie down in good grazing land, and there they will feed in a rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. As for you, my flock, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will judge between one sheep and another, and between rams and goats. Is it not enough for you to feed on the good pasture? Must you also trample the rest of your pasture with your feet? Is it not enough for you to drink clear water? Must you also muddy the rest with your feet? Must my flock feed on what you have trampled and drink what you have muddied with your feet? Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says to them. See, I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep. Because you shove with flank and shoulder, butting all the weak sheep with your horns until you have driven them away, I will save my flock, and they will no longer be plundered. I will judge between one sheep and another. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. I will make a covenant of peace with them and rid the land of savage beasts, so that they may live in the wilderness and sleep in the forests in safety. I will make them and the places surrounding my hill a blessing. I will send down showers in season. There will be showers of blessing. The trees will yield their fruit, and the ground will yield its crops, and the people will be secure in their land. They will know that I am the Lord when I break the bars of their yoke and rescue them from the hands of those who enslaved them. They will no longer be plundered by the nations, nor will wild animals devour them. They will live in safety, and no one will make them afraid. I will provide for them a land renowned for its crops, and they will no longer be victims of famine in the land or bear the scorn of the nations. Then they will know that I, the Lord their God, am with them, and that they, the Israelites, are my people, declares the Lord. You are my sheep, the sheep of my pasture, and I am your God, declares the sovereign Lord.
All right, if you're still with us, I think it's tomorrow. That's really good news for the sheep, for the people of God, unless you're one of the leaders.
Yeah.
And that's just, I mean, you can't possibly read that and not think of the Pharisees, you know.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about that later.
I know, but yeah, it's very much in line with.
Well, think of it in the context of their time too. You know that their leadership had let them down. Like,
yes.
you know, Ezekiel was supposed to be the good watchman, but their own leadership hadn't been, you know, telling them the truth and leading them into the covenant ways.
There's a verse we didn't read from Lamentations where it talks about the Gentile nations reviling the priests and prophets as unclean. And like the Gentiles who don't even have the cleanliness law see the very priests and prophets of God's people as unclean. That's how terrible the leadership was. And that's exactly what's going on here.
Yeah, and you see in here this judgment of God against the shepherds, and then that's how that precedes the knowledge of God, and then God Himself comes and leads, and we learn to know Him firsthand by His leadership in our lives, and so He also breaks their bondage. Right? He says He's going to break the bar of bondage off them, just calling back to the Exodus and saving them out of Egypt again. Another time when they knew that He was the Lord. And He's going to bring him into a promised land, right? He's telling him, I'm going to take you into a great land with great food, great produce, great waters, you know, all these things. And so it's a lot of echoes of the past, of the lesson they should have learned who God was back then, and they didn't.
Yeah. It's such an interesting juxtaposition here, the way that God works versus the way that man works, the wisdom of God and the wisdom of man. Like he's saying, I'm going to heal the weak and, you know, take care of the weak in the flock and kill all the strong ones. It's like the opposite of what mankind would think.
Yeah, it often is, and it's because the people ignored God's commands. There were so many commands about social justice, about, you know, justice for the rich and the poor, and the weak and the strong.
Yeah, well, we saw that in Isaiah and Jeremiah as well. That you're supposed to be pleading the cause of the widow and taking care of the downtrodden. Yeah,
and it was because leadership was corrupt that those things weren't happening. And there's so many parallels in this passage that we have this pledge where we stick to the Old Testament while we're in the Old Testament. But I'll just mention, not all of these are New Testament. Some of them are Old Testament. So some things that you may have noticed in there, like Psalm 23, right? He said He was going to let them lay down in the pasture, you know, by the waters. So you got the 23rd Psalm. The lost sheep. He kept talking about the lost sheep, and I'm going to go out and get you, right? That's definitely something you see in Jesus' teachings. The good shepherd, He talks about being their shepherd, right? We saw that, you know, in the New Testament. And the sheep and the goats, we're going to actually look at that passage later. But, you know, He talks about making a judgment between the sheep and the rams and the goats and the different sheep between other sheep and so on. So we're going to talk about that later. but there's so many things that Jesus grabbed onto from this passage, I think,
Mhm.
and also, call
Yeah,
up.
I think it's appropriate to bring it up now. I mean, we're about to move into the New Testament anyway,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
all of those things didn't just get made up on the spot. Like Jesus is
yes,
drawing on the Old Testament
calling
when
people
he
back to
teaches
the
them.
covenant.
Yeah.
So the people could have listened. That's the whole point. The people could have listened in the first place. They could have learned when God brought them out with a mighty hand, that he was God. They could have made the pledge there in Exodus 20 to follow all of his commands and never forget, but they forgot. They forgot
Well,
him.
how
They
do you
forgot the
forget,
covenant.
right? By not upholding the Shema.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's our big theme from our entire podcast is passing it down to the next generation, like father and son here.
Mhm.
And since they've rejected God, right, then now there's a judgment that's required to restore knowledge of God. It's utterly ridiculous because it's so unnecessary, but it ends up being necessary because of what the people have done.
Yeah, and it's not just God being punitive, it has a purpose. Like he said in Jeremiah 29:11, that's one of those classic quoted verses. You'll see it on bumper stickers and people's living room walls. For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you and not harm you. Well, the context of that is it's in Jeremiah. He's talking about exile in that chapter. He's talking about putting them into
Mhm.
exile.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like not because he wants you to have a Mercedes. It's because
He
it's
has
because you're not listening. And
he has Jeremiah buy that land to say that there's going to be a future here someday,
yeah,
but it's not right now. But
the
do
point
this.
yeah, the point of the punishment is look, if I bless you, you ignore me. So
Mhm.
you can't ignore suffering.
Yeah.
Wake up.
So the Old Testament takeaway, right, from Ezekiel here is God's judgments lead us back to the knowledge of God. So,
Hmm.
and it's all throughout there. We've only given you 3 examples, but just read it yourself and you'll see that, God's judgments lead us back to the knowledge of God. So now we're going to turn to the New Testament, like Caleb said, and we're going to see if we can find this theme there. I think it's going to be pretty easy. Uh, but remember, the title of our series is "Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him?" And it because Jesus is a prophet, and we've had an easy time of going through the Old Testament and getting the main themes out of the books and saying, how does Jesus use this theme? He uses every single one of them, and Ezekiel will be no different. So.
Hmm.
Um, Here's some examples of how Jesus used Ezekiel's message in his teachings. And like I said, we were going to talk about this. It's going to be what we lead off with is the sheep and the goats. So in Matthew 25:31 through 46, we're going to compare that. We're going to do this first so you can compare it to Ezekiel 34 that we just read. Caleb, would you read this?
Yeah. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people from one another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me. They also will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothes, or sick or in prison, and did not help you? He will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life.
So I love the way Ezekiel 34 has the stories in there about, well, you took your shoulder and pushed the other sheep
Yeah.
out of the way so that you were stronger, so you got what you wanted.
Yeah, it
And
wasn't enough that you had
yeah,
the good land. You had to trample the other land.
yeah, make it unusable for everybody else because you were big and strong and you just strutted around and did what you wanted and destroyed everything for everybody else. And so then you read this, and when you know what's in Jesus' mind,
Hmm.
it makes it so much more rich. I mean, because even though this is rich too, when he's talking about these things about people in prison and so on and strangers. But when you think about just bullying your way through life, grabbing what's yours, it's very narcissistic.
I also think there's a connection here. I'm going to bring up that Psalm passage now. I just decided this is the right the right time to do it. um, because we talked about, if you remember, all the way back to Psalm chapter 1, we talked about kind of the two paths, right? Where the one is the tree planted by the water, the man who meditates on the law of the Lord.
Mhm.
And then kind of the surprise at the end of the passage is the guy who's meditating on God, he doesn't figure God out. He doesn't know God. He's known by God. Then we again looked at Jesus giving the Sermon on the Mount and using that same language of people being known by God or not known by God. And there's that same language again, right? Like who
Mhm.
helped you, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and he doesn't know them.
And Ezekiel, that you will know that I am the Lord.
Yes,
Yeah.
and you know that he's the Lord. And so here in Psalm 19, this is verse 7 through 14. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The decrees of the Lord are firm, and all of them are righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the honeycomb. By them your servant is warned. In keeping them there is great reward. But who can discern their own errors? Forgive my hidden faults. Keep your servant also from willful sins. May they not rule over me. Then I will be blameless, innocent of great transgression. May these words of my mouth and this meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So first of all, there's some more of that parallelism. He said the same thing like 8 times in a row, that the law of the Lord is good. It's good. It's good. It's good. Here's a dozen different ways. And that's the point, right? You meditate on that. If you follow the Shema, you bind it on your heart. You speak of it, meditate on it when you get up and go out, when you come in and lie down. Pass it on to the next generation. Then it works.
Mm-hmm.
But if you aren't doing that, which the people were not, then this is what happens. And the only way to be reminded of it is for God to have to do it through judgment. And that's mentioned too here in verse 11 when he says that your servant is warned by the law.
Like the watchman.
Yes, and like David is another watchman here.
Mm-hmm.
Like all of Moses, all of the authors of the scripture, they're the watchmen. And they're supposed to be, like, if we're passing this down from generation to generation, then there should be some watchmen in every generation.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I think that's true. Like, when we talk about people in the Bible as being saints, the guys that, wrote the Gospels are saints or whatever, the apostles were saints. And, part of that is they did what God asked them to do. I mean, they weren't perfect, but they were the watchmen. Like God gave them a message and he's like, I'm giving you a message. You'd better give it to other people. And if you do, you'll save yourself,
Yeah.
So, yeah. So in your own life, when you know God's leading you, you need to follow his leadership.
Yeah. And the people that he chooses to raise up are not, like we saw with the way that the good shepherd works. He doesn't just hog all the finest sheep. Like it's so bizarre what he says in Ezekiel there, I'm going to bind all the wounded ones and heal the sick ones and then kill the strong ones.
Yeah.
It's like, what? Yeah, I'm going to pick Moses, a stutterer, to go carry my message, and David, who's the smallest pipsqueak of the bunch, to be the king. And Jesus calls a bunch of fishermen and prostitutes to be his disciples.
Well, and we've talked about the letter in Revelation, the letter to the Laodiceans, and their whole problem was that they were like, I've got this. I'm self-sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
I'm good. I can do it. I'm beautiful. I'm strong. And Jesus is like,
No, you're
no,
naked
you're not.
and weak.
You're naked
Yeah.
and ugly
Yeah.
and weak and sad, but you
Hmm.
don't realize it, because you're so conceited. And that's why I spit you out of my mouth, because
Hmm.
you're poisonous. Your conceited thinking is poisonous. Well, I mean, that's this kind of thinking, right? This kind of thinking that's like, I'll get what's mine because I'm strong, and God's made me that way. And it's just
Hmm.
all upside down and wrong.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you that you've not made me like this tax collector here.
yeah, yeah. Hitting him with your shoulder, boom,
Yeah.
knock him out of the temple. So, okay, so let's move to John 8, verses 21 through 30. It says, once more, Jesus said to them, I am going away, and you will look for me, and you will die in your sin. Where I go, you cannot come. This made the Jews ask, will he kill himself? Is that why he says, where I go, you cannot come? But he continued, you are from below, I am from above. You are of this world, I am not of this world. I told you you would die in your sins. If you do not believe that I am he, you will indeed die in your sins. Who are you? They asked. Just what I have been telling you from the beginning, Jesus replied. I have much to say in judgment of you, but he who sent me is trustworthy, and what I have heard from him, I tell the world. They did not understand that he was telling them about his Father. So Jesus said, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own, but speak just what the Father has taught me. The one who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do what pleases him. Even as he spoke, many believed in him. And I just want to point out, like, this whole theme of Ezekiel being a watchman that we talked about earlier. We spent a lot of time reading those passages. Listen to Jesus' words there. Like,
Yeah.
whatever the Father's telling me, I'm telling all of you.
Just like that warning about tell
Yeah.
the wicked, warn them.
Yeah, he's taking his job as a watchman to all of us, as the greatest prophet who's ever lived. He's making sure that every single word God gives him, he's giving to us. It reminds me of the verse, my favorite verse about Samuel in 1 Samuel, where it says, God was with him and not one of his words fell to the ground or something like that.
Hmm.
It's just like Jesus is the same way. He's like, yeah, I'm going to pass every word to you exactly the way I'm supposed to.
Yeah.
And it's just a really cool.
And then so you'll know that I am he. And I mean that
Yeah.
whole chapter of John 8, if you go and read that, is probably the strongest chapter in the gospel of claiming Christ's divinity. I mean, that's what culminates in that, before Abraham was, I am. And there's just no way, unless you simply have zero biblical or historical Jewish understanding, there's no way to miss that as
Mhm.
a unequivocal claim to be God.
Well, they're questioning his identity here. They're saying, well, who are you? And so
Mhm.
he talks to them. He says, well, I have a lot to say to you in judgment.
Mhm.
So he's saying, you want to learn who I am? Well, guess what?
I'm the one that can judge you.
Judgment is what tells you I am the Son of Man, because the Son of Man is the powerful figure where we're going to do Daniel next week.
Yeah.
Next
That's where
episode.
the Son of
And
Man
the Son
comes
of
in.
Man is this powerful figure of judgment that comes on the clouds. And Jesus is saying, well, I have a lot. I could just judge you if that's what you want. You want to learn who I am. But you know what you're going to see is I'm going to be lifted up. Now, this is like really amazing stuff, because Jesus is, and I don't want to take too much away from next week, but Jesus is saying, I'm going to be lifted up and put on the cross. I'm actually going to be judged by men,
Mhm.
because you're saying I'm not really who I say I am. You're going to judge me for that, and you're going to kill me and raise me up and put me on a cross. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to use that as the ultimate judgment against you.
Mhm.
But I'm taking it all on myself, as the substitutional sacrifice for you.
Mhm.
And you're going to see that judgment lifted up and say, wait, that was supposed to be my judgment. And then he says, then you're definitely going to know that I am the Son of Man, as I said I was, because you're going to see judgment in its fullness in me, and it's what's going to save you. You're finally going to know who God is
Yeah.
when you see that. So
That's
it's really cool.
interesting. I never thought about putting a connection between this passage and the story where he heals the paralytic who's brought down through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
Where it says that they marveled that, he tells them, so you will know that authority to forgive sins is given to men. That
Mm-hmm.
they're shocked. Who has the authority to forgive sins but God alone? Well, he's also got the authority to judge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right here,
Yes, he does.
and I think that's an interesting. It's an interesting point. Especially in the gospel, it's a lot easier for us to focus on Christ's mercy. Which
Well,
certainly is there, but he also comes as a judge. He brings a sword to the
yeah.
world, and he
Mm-hmm.
he in Revelation he comes back to judge the living and the
Mm-hmm.
dead.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so, judgment also goes along with punishment, and, rightfully so. But I just wanted to read out of Hebrews chapter 12, verses 7 through 11 that talk about punishment that we receive as humans from our parents, and how that helps teach us about this principle of how judgment and discipline and punishment can help us learn to be better people, which we know. But let's listen to this in Hebrews 12, 7 through 11 says, endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as sons. For what son is not disciplined by his father? If you're not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are illegitimate children and not true sons. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of our spirits and live? Our fathers disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. And right there in that, Caleb, where it talked about that God disciplines us for our good, reminds me of what you were saying about Jeremiah. It's like people putting their bumper stickers. I've got plans for your good, to
Yeah. Well, it's like, if
it includes this discipline.
you can't just let your child do whatever they want to do. If you have to smack their hand away from the candy jar for the 12th time that day, or whatever. You have to. You can't just let them play in the road and eat all the junk food they want. There has to be discipline. They have to, and they're going to think it's miserable. I can't wait till I'm grown up and I can stay up till midnight and eat ice cream every day. And it's like, well, once you're in your late 20s, that doesn't work out so well.
Well, and also in this Hebrews passage, it talks about holiness, and it says it's going to work out for our holiness. And so that's good too, right?
Yeah.
Because our holiness is what shows God to the world.
Yeah, it's what makes you be able to perform righteous deeds is his judgment. It's like that goes back to that's why I wanted to bring up that Psalm 19 passage, because of the goodness of the law. Like there's an idea in some schools of theological thought that there are like multiple uses of God's law. We don't have to get into all that, but just that there's kind of like different ways, different spheres of life you can apply it in. And one of the applications is as a mirror, like to look at yourself against the law and realize how short you come against that.
Mm-hmm.
We all have sinned and fallen short. And the law shows us our sin. Paul talks about this extensively. We're supposed to recognize its goodness and our shortcomings. It doesn't take away from the goodness of it, that we can't live up to it. And the only way we can is with Christ's help here. And that's what God is saying. He's teaching us. If you don't appreciate it at all, then first of all, you have to be made to appreciate it, or you're not going to even try to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and other people see, like when the law is born in your life and bears fruit, when the Spirit of Jesus Christ living through you, right, produces holiness and produces righteous works.
Some will see, although others will respond like Pharaoh, like we talked about earlier. Some people are going to, when the goodness of God is present, they just won't accept it no matter what.
Well, Judas heard all the same teaching as the other disciples.
Yes. So, well, that goes back to what God was telling Ezekiel. You don't get a free pass just because 99% of the people don't listen to you. You still have to preach this.
Yeah.
You have to give them that chance. You have to give them the message. And a couple people might listen and be saved.
Well, an interesting passage that we've talked about before that I'll just mention here briefly is Philippians 2:9-11, which we know that all people are going to be subject to Christ. All people are subject to Christ. But
Well, the Lord has put everything under his
yeah,
feet.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And you were talking about his authority to judge and so on. And so in Philippians 2:9-11 says, therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Now, this is talking about like a time of final judgment when everyone has to admit that Jesus was the Lord.
hmm
And so this is actually a time of perfect knowledge, right? At the end of all things and the consummation of all things, everyone has perfect knowledge now at that point, and everyone will acknowledge that Jesus is Lord,
Yeah.
and will see him in his glory and God being glorified by Christ. But for many people, that's going to be too late when that final
Well,
knowledge
the
comes.
demons know that, and
Yeah.
they shudder.
That's right. Yeah.
That's not an intellectual comprehension
Yeah.
of Christ's position
Mm.
and acts is not enough to save you.
And the
You're not
separation,
trusting in him.
the separation of the sheep and the goats, kind of thing that a
Mhm.
lot of times when we look at that passage, like we think of it as the final judgment, the sheep and the goats being separated, but it's also a judgment of how we act in this world, like in Ezekiel, clearly that it's like this social justice thing of why are you mistreating people just because you're stronger than they are? It's silly. And Jesus is calling us to do better than that, but he's also going to have to judge us at the end of time. He knows. Ezekiel doesn't have to. Ezekiel's just giving a temporal judgment, like
Yeah.
there's bad things coming because you've all been bad to other people. But Jesus has to do this final judgment where he's like, okay, you're going to submit to me at my courtroom, at my bar, and I'm going to have to make this judgment. You're going to know that, and again, at judgment time gives us knowledge of God. You're going to have the full, perfect knowledge of who God is, but it's going to be because of judgment, not because you learn to love him in your life and love other people
Yeah.
and
Well,
follow his
speaking of-
perfect law. that you
Speaking
talk
of
about.
the final judgment, let's go to Revelation.
Yeah, let's do it.
Revelation 2:18-23. To the angel of the church in Thyatira write, these are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like blazing fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. I know your deeds, your love and faith, your service and perseverance, and that you are now doing more than you did at first. Nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet. By her teaching, she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. I have given her time to repent of her immorality, but she is unwilling. So I will cast her on a bed of suffering, and I will make those who commit adultery with her suffer intensely unless they repent of her ways. I will strike her children dead. Then all the churches will know that I am he who searches hearts and minds, and I will repay each of you according to your deeds. So there's that you will know who I am, and there's the judgment. I'll repay you according to your deeds.
Yeah, it's very similar to the Ezekiel passage we saw where he said, I'm gonna have the bodies slain around the idols, and here you have the children lying dead because they're worshiping idols again, and that type of thing. And you may not have noticed this, and we haven't read this verse from Ezekiel, but if you're familiar with Ezekiel, this passage about burnished bronze feet, that John, when he sees this image for the church, here he sees the Son of God, and his feet are like burnished bronze, it says. Well, in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 7, right at the very first oracle that Ezekiel gives in Ezekiel 1:4-9, he says, I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their four sides, they had human hands. All four of them had faces and wings, and the wings of one touched the wings of another. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. So John describes the feet of Christ the same way that Ezekiel describes the feet of these cherubim or flying creatures or whatever they were here. And so it's interesting because it's the same message, for Israelites about idol worshiping, and in Ezekiel 6 that we saw.
As well as in Revelation.
We're seeing like all these themes from Ezekiel that John's recalling in his visions that he sees in the book of Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the thing about striking them dead, and he gives, and what's interesting here is that he says he's going to give them time to repent, which was interesting in the Revelation passage. So,
well, that's the Revelation. What's seen in Revelation hasn't come yet.
Well, it says they didn't listen, right?
Patient and merciful on us, giving us more and more time here.
He said I'd given her time to repent of her immorality, but she was unwilling. It says, so it's just again again and again. God comes and we don't listen, and so. But this is an example though where judgment again leads to knowledge of God. So. And so what we saw in all these passages in the New Testament is the judgment leading to knowledge of God, but we also saw a little wrinkle where Jesus told us that, he got the judgment we deserved. He was lifted up. And when you see that, when he's lifted up to give all men knowledge of God, right, that those who believe that Jesus is Lord are saved.
Yeah.
So that leads to our New Testament takeaway. You want to read that to everybody?
Yes. Jesus Christ willingly took the judgment we deserved so we might know that he is the Lord.
And so that's God is speaking to you through Jesus, through Ezekiel, through his watchmen.
Moses. Yeah, all the watchmen.
Yeah.
Even through Biblocus.
That's right. Wow,
somehow.
Flattering. And they're all the voices, all the watchmen are telling you the same thing. They're telling you everything God has told them to tell you. And they're trying to get you to know that I am the Lord, as God would say, from his first person perspective that Ezekiel is given. And so we're just pleading with you to hear the message and to repent and be saved.
Yeah, it's a call back to the covenant. That's an important thing. I've brought this up multiple times, right? The covenants are not replacing one another. We're talking about the Old Testament, which is the same thing as covenant, Old Covenant, New Covenant. Some people will break it down. Well, there's a covenant with Adam, with Noah, Abraham, Moses, all these covenants. It's all building on the same covenant. It's amendments, addendums being added to the covenant between God and his people. And the addendums have to be added because of us. God's not like changing his mind. It's trying to be patient with us, trying to work with us all the way from where he gives the law there, says, I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, and gives the law to Moses, to now in Revelation saying that I am the one who looks into your hearts and minds.
Yeah.
Like it's the same God who's giving us the law, who's giving us his commands as well as his salvation and forgiveness. And it's the same covenant throughout. And this is a call to repentance, to obedience.
Yeah.
Right? It's a little bit more of a harsh lesson than an ending than we often end. A lot of times we end it on kind of like, be baptized, join a church. But I think maybe the best way to end here is to kind of remind people that we are beholden to obey God's commands.
Yeah, know who is the Lord. I mean, he's the one who's in charge. He has the authority to judge, and learn his law. I mean, it's so cool, I think, to see. We always say, well, there's really nothing new in the New Testament, right? I mean, here we see that God calls Ezekiel to be a watchman and tell everybody the words that I have to tell you. And then we see Jesus using Ezekiel's own words, and, using his analogies about separating the sheep and the goats and all these things. And we see John in Revelation using some of the imagery from Ezekiel and the same messages. And you realize, there really isn't anything new, guys. I mean, it's the same message. We could have just listened to God at first and had the same knowledge of God, but we refused.
The fact that God is in a position to grant us mercy is because He's in the position to judge us, right?
Sure,
Like
that's true.
If you're charged with a crime, you go and plead your case to the judge.
Yes.
He's the one who has the authority to throw you in jail. You don't run to the cashier at Kroger like, please have mercy on me. It's just like, sir, please leave. Like you have to appeal for mercy to the one who can judge you. That's the only way that works or makes sense.
Yeah, and that's actually the real lesson of the story of the persistent widow.
Yeah.
When why does she keep going back to that judge and bugging him? And he finally gives her what she wants, and people go, "Oh, that just tells you keep asking God. Eventually, He'll give you what you want." No, it's knowing that He's the only one who can possibly help you.
Mm-hmm.
You would never go to anybody else, like the cashier at Kroger. I don't know why we're picking on her, but
Just made something up. I don't know.
But you go back to that judge because it's the only source of that where you can get the justice that you deserve. And so that's why you should go to God, because He's the only place you can. Know that He is the Lord. He is the only one you can turn to. So.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, he's Caleb and I'm Timothy, and thank you for listening to Bible discussions on Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. Please consider subscribing to our channel and helping support our efforts. All scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are taken from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright by Biblica Inc., used by permission of Zondervan, all rights reserved. This program is copyright 2024 by Timothy Klingerman. God bless all of you.